Venezuela opens the door to a new order. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not because it was the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in Venezuela's presidential election, but because of what happened in the hours and days that followed. The official results, announced by the National Electoral Council, declared Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote. The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez, cried fraud, producing thousands of tally sheets that suggested he had actually won by a landslide. The United States, the European Union, and a dozen Latin American nations refused to recognize the result. Protests erupted in Caracas, and the world braced for another round of Venezuelan instability. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this moment is far more significant than a disputed election. What we're witnessing isn't just another chapter in Venezuela's chronic crisis, it's the opening act of a fundamental realignment in global power. And if you're only paying attention to the headlines about voter fraud and street protests, you're missing the real story. Let me explain why. The official what they want you to believe. The story being sold to the public is straightforward. Venezuela, a country that has been in economic freefall for over a decade, held an election. The incumbent, Nicolas Maduro, a man who has overseen the collapse of what was once Latin America's richest economy, somehow managed to win. The opposition, which had united behind a single candidate for the first time in years, claimed the election was stolen. The U.S. and its allies, citing irregularities, refused to recognize the result. The Organization of American States called for new elections. The media framed it as a classic case of authoritarianism clinging to power through fraud. The numbers seem to support this narrative. Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by over 75% since 2013. More than 7 million people have fled the country. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. The opposition's tally sheets, which they claim represent 80% of polling stations, show Gonzalez winning by a margin of nearly 20 points. The Carter Center, which had observers on the ground, said the election did not meet international standards. The U.S. State Department called it a sham. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, what's left unsaid is often more important than what's said. Deconstructing the official what's really happening. Let's start with the election itself. Yes, there were irregularities, there always are in Venezuela. But the idea that this was a simple case of Maduro stealing an election he clearly lost doesn't hold up under scrutiny. For one thing, the opposition's own internal polling in the weeks leading up to the vote showed a much closer race than their post-election claims suggest. Some polls had Maduro ahead, others had Gonzalez winning by a narrow margin. The opposition's tally sheets, while compelling, are not official results, they're copies of what they claim were the original records. The National Electoral Council, which is controlled by the government, has not released the full data, making it impossible to independently verify either side's claims. But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. and its allies have been pushing for regime change in Venezuela for years. The Trump administration imposed crippling sanctions, recognized Juan Guaido as interim president, and even reportedly considered military options. The Biden administration has been more cautious, but it has maintained sanctions and kept the door open for a negotiated transition. So when the opposition claims fraud, Washington is quick to believe them, not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because it fits a pre-existing narrative. Now, let's talk about what's really at stake. Venezuela isn't just another failed state, it's the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. It's also a key ally of Russia, China, and Iran. And right now, all 3 of those powers are deeply invested in keeping Maduro in power. Russia has been Venezuela's most vocal supporter. It has sent military advisors, provided loans, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the country in a show of force. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, securing long-term supply deals that bypass Western sanctions. And Iran has helped Venezuela evade U.S. restrictions, sending tankers of gasoline and even drones to bolster Maduro's security forces. So when the U.S. and its allies cry fraud, they're not just talking about an election, they're talking about a geopolitical battleground. And Maduro knows it. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Americas. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for influence in Latin America, a region that the US has long considered its backyard. For decades, Washington has operated under the Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to foreign powers. But in recent years, Russia and China have been making inroads, challenging US dominance. China, in particular, has been aggressive. It's now the largest trading partner for most of Latin America, investing heavily in infrastructure, mining, and energy. Russia, meanwhile, has been cultivating military ties, selling weapons to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And both countries have been using Venezuela as a testing ground for their ability to operate in the US's traditional sphere of influence. This is where the Venezuela crisis fits into the bigger picture. If Maduro falls, it would be a major blow to Russia and China. It would also send a message to other leftist governments in the region, like those in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Honduras, that the US is still the dominant power in Latin America. But if Maduro survives, it would signal that the US is no longer able to dictate outcomes in its own neighborhood. This is why the election isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of the Western Hemisphere. And it's why the US is so invested in the outcome. But here's the US is playing a losing game. The more it pushes for regime change, the more it alienates other countries in the region. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, all of which have leftist governments, have been cautious in their response to the election. They've called for transparency, but they haven't joined the US in rejecting the results. And that's because they see what Washington refuses to, that the era of US hegemony in Latin America is over. Military and strategic, the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The US has a long history of intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA. And there are voices in Washington, particularly among the hawks, who see Venezuela as the next target. But here's the: Venezuela is not AMA. It's not Grenada. It's a country of 28 million people with a well-armed military, a population that has endured years of hardship, and powerful allies in Moscow and Beijing. Any military intervention would be a disaster. I'm not saying the US is planning an invasion. But the rhetoric coming out of Washington is dangerous. When US officials talk about all options being on the table, they're not just bluffing, they're signaling to Maduro that he's in a precarious position. And that kind of language can lead to miscalculations. We've seen this before. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president and imposed crippling sanctions. The idea was that the Venezuelan military would abandon Maduro, and the regime would collapse. But it didn't happen. The military stayed loyal, the sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the elite, and Maduro survived. The lesson? Economic pressure alone isn't enough to bring down a regime. And military intervention would be a catastrophe. Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and any conflict would send global energy markets into chaos. It would also trigger a refugee crisis that would dwarf what we've seen so far. And it would give Russia and China an excuse to deepen their involvement in the region. So why does the US keep pushing? Because the hawks in Washington believe that if they don't act now, they'll lose Latin America forever. And they're right, just not in the way they think. The domestic political why Washington can't let go. This isn't just about geopolitics, it's also about domestic politics. The US has a large and influential Venezuelan diaspora, particularly in Florida, a key swing state. For years, politicians in both parties have used Venezuela as a rallying cry, promising to stand up to Maduro and support democracy in the region. But here's the more the US pushes for regime change, the more it becomes a partisan issue. Republicans accuse Democrats of being soft on Maduro. Democrats accuse Republicans of being warmongers. And in the process, the actual interests of the Venezuelan people get lost in the noise. Take the Biden administration's response to the election. On the one hand, it has been cautious, avoiding the kind of reckless rhetoric we saw under Trump. On the other hand, it has maintained sanctions and refused to recognize Maduro's victory. The result? A policy that satisfies neither the hawks nor the doves. And that's the real tragedy. Because the truth is, there are no good options in Venezuela. The US can't force Maduro out without risking a wider conflict. But it can't ignore the crisis either, because doing so would embolden other authoritarian regimes in the region. So what's the solution? That's the question no one in Washington seems willing to answer. Scenario: what comes next? Let's look at the possible outcomes. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, international pressure forces Maduro to negotiate with the opposition. A power-sharing agreement is reached, leading to new elections within a year. The US lifts some sanctions, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding its economy. Russia and China, seeing the writing on the wall, reduce their involvement. This is the outcome the US and its allies are hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He's survived this long by playing hardball. And the opposition is too divided to present a unified front. Scenario 2, the most likely. In this scenario, Maduro survives but remains isolated. The US and its allies maintain sanctions, and Venezuela's economy continues to struggle. The opposition remains in disarray, and the country becomes even more dependent on Russia and China. Over time, Venezuela becomes a de facto client state of Moscow and Beijing, hosting Russian military bases and Chinese oil infrastructure. This is the scenario that should worry Washington the most. Because it means that the US has lost influence in its own backyard, and Russia and China have gained a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, the US and its allies take more aggressive action. Sanctions are tightened, and covert operations are launched to destabilize the regime. Maduro responds by cracking down even harder, arresting opposition leaders and shutting down dissent. Russia and China increased their support, sending more military advisors and economic aid. The situation spirals into a full-blown crisis, with the risk of direct conflict between the US and Russia. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because once you start down that road, it's hard to turn back. Grand strategy: the decline of American hegemony. Here's the hard: the US is trying to maintain a global order that no longer exists. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that it can dictate outcomes in every corner of the world. But that era is over. The US is still the world's most powerful country, but it's no longer the only one. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And the rest of the world is no longer willing to accept US dominance. This is what the realists have been warning about for the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar one. Venezuela is a perfect example of this shift. The US sees it as a problem to be solved. But for Russia and China, it's an opportunity, a chance to challenge US influence in the Western Hemisphere. And they're winning. The US has two choices. It can continue to cling to the old order, using sanctions and military threats to try to maintain its dominance. Or it can accept that the world is changing and adapt its strategy accordingly. The first option will lead to more crises like Venezuela. The second option will require humility, a recognition that the US can no longer dictate outcomes, but must instead negotiate with other powers. But humility has never been Washington's strong suit. Alternatives and what should be done instead. So what's the alternative? Here's what I would. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a zero-sum game. The goal shouldn't be to force Maduro out, it should be to stabilize the country and improve the lives of its people. That means engaging with the regime, not isolating it. Second, the US should work with other countries in the region to find a diplomatic solution. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia have all played a constructive role in the past, and they should be brought into the conversation. The US can't solve this problem alone. Third, the US should lift some of the most damaging sanctions. The current measures are hurting ordinary Venezuelans more than the elite, and they're pushing the country further into the arms of Russia and China. A more targeted approach, one that punishes human rights abusers without crippling the economy, would be more effective. Finally, the US needs to accept that it can't control every outcome. Venezuela is a sovereign country, and its people will ultimately decide its future. The US can influence that future, but it can't dictate it. This is a controversial position, I know. But it's the only one that makes sense. Reflective: the danger of ignoring reality. Let me leave you with this: the Venezuela crisis is a symptom of a larger problem. The US is trying to hold on to a global order that is slipping away. And the more it clings to that order, the more it risks overreach. The mainstream media will continue to frame this as a story about democracy versus authoritarianism. But the real story is about power: who has it, who wants it, and what they're willing to do to keep it. The US has a choice. It can continue to act as if it's still the sole superpower, or it can accept that the world is changing and adapt accordingly. The first option will lead to more crises. The second option will require humility and compromise. But here's the American people have a role to play in this. The more they demand a foreign policy based on realism rather than ideology, the more likely it is that Washington will listen. Because in the end, informed citizens are the only brake on government overreach. And right now, we need that brake more than ever. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's shifting geopolitical posture isn't just about oil or sanctions, it's about the quiet reconfiguration of military power in the Western Hemisphere. And that should worry Washington far more than any election result in Caracas. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its strategic backyard, a region where military influence was assumed, not earned. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was an operating system. But that system is now glitching. Venezuela's recent moves, deepening military cooperation with Russia, hosting Iranian drones, and even floating the idea of Chinese naval bases, aren't just provocations. They're symptoms of a broader erosion of US dominance in what was once considered an uncontested sphere of influence. Take the Russian angle first. Since 2005, Moscow has sold Venezuela over $11 billion in arms, including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. In 2023 alone, Russian military advisors were spotted at Venezuela's El Libertador airbase, and there are credible reports of joint exercises simulating anti-aircraft operations. Now, I'm not suggesting Venezuela is about to launch an invasion of Colombia. But the mere presence of these systems forces the US to recalculate its own military posture in the region. Every Russian radar installation in Venezuela is a potential blind spot for US surveillance flights over the Caribbean. Every Iranian drone test is a data point for how quickly asymmetric threats can be deployed in America's near abroad. Here's the uncomfortable: the US hasn't had to seriously contemplate a peer competitor operating in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And back then, the Soviet Union was a distant power projecting influence. Today, Russia and China aren't just projecting, they're embedding. China's $1.5 billion loan to Venezuela in 2023 wasn't just financial aid, it was a down payment on future access. Beijing has already built a satellite tracking station in Venezuela's Bolívar state, ostensibly for civilian use, but with clear dual-use potential. And let's not forget the 2019 visit by a Chinese naval hospital ship to Venezuela, a move that was as much about soft power as it was about signaling. The military implications of this are profound. The U.S. Southern Command, which oversees operations in Latin America, has seen its budget stagnate even as its mission grows more complex. In 2022, Southcom's commander, General Laura Richardson, testified before Congress that China was aggressively extending its economic, diplomatic, technological, informational, and military influence in the region. She wasn't exaggerating. China now accounts for 15% of Latin America's trade, up from just 2% in 2000. And where trade goes, military cooperation often follows. Ecuador, once a staunch U.S. ally, now hosts Chinese military advisors under the guise of counter-narcotics training. Bolivia has allowed Russian military technicians to service its helicopters. Even Argentina, long a U.S. partner, is flirting with Chinese fighter jets. Now, I can already hear that these are just symbolic moves. None of these countries are going to abandon the U.S. for Russia or China. And to some extent, that's true. But symbols matter in geopolitics. Every time a Latin American leader shakes hands with Putin or Xi, it sends a message: you are not the only game in town. And that message is being received loud and clear in the Pentagon. Let me put this in historical context. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin America to prevent chronic wrongdoing. Over the next century, the U.S. invaded Nicaragua, occupied Haiti, and backed coups in Guatemala, Chile, and beyond. The message was Latin America was a U.S. sphere of influence, and no outside power was welcome. But today, that corollary is dead. The U.S. can't invade Venezuela like it did AMA in 1989. It can't overthrow Maduro like it did Allende in 1973. The world has changed, and the U.S. hasn't fully adapted. So what does this mean for U.S. military strategy? First, it means accepting that the Western Hemisphere is no longer a U.S. monopoly. The days of unilateral intervention are over. Second, it means investing in partnerships rather than dependencies. The U.S. should be working with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to counterbalance Russian and Chinese influence, not demanding they pick sides. And third, it means modernizing Southcom's capabilities. The U.S. needs more surveillance assets, more cyber defenses, and more flexible response options to counter the kind of hybrid threats that Russia and China are perfecting. But here's the none of this will work if the U.S. keeps treating Latin America as a secondary theater. For too long, Washington has seen the region through the lens of migration and drug trafficking, not great power competition. That's a mistake. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing challenge and Russia as an acute threat. But if you look at where those challenges are playing out, Latin America is the soft underbelly of U.S. strategy. And right now, it's getting softer. Let me leave you with the U.S. is still the most powerful military in the world, but power is relative. Every time Venezuela hosts a Russian warship, every time China builds a port in Argentina, every time Iran tests a drone in Caracas, the U.S. loses a little more leverage. And leverage is what keeps the peace. The question isn't whether the U.S. can still project power in Latin America. It's whether it can do so without triggering a crisis that spirals out of control. Because here's the thing about great power, it's not just about who has the biggest army. It's about who can shape the environment in which conflicts are decided before they even begin. And right now, Russia and China are doing a better job of that in Latin America than the U.S. is. That's not a failure of military might. It's a failure of imagination. And in geopolitics, imagination is often the difference between dominance and decline. Now, what most people don't realize is that this failure of imagination isn't just happening in Washington's foreign policy circles, it's mirrored in Venezuela's domestic politics, where the same old narratives are being recycled with diminishing returns. Maduro's government has spent the last decade perfecting the art of survival, but survival isn't the same as stability. And in the long run, that distinction could be the difference between a managed transition and a full-blown collapse. Let me explain why this matters. When I was in Caracas last year, the city felt like a place caught between two realities. On the surface, there were the polished government press releases about economic recovery, the carefully staged rallies with red-clad supporters, and the official GDP growth numbers, 4.2% in 2023, according to the central bank. But beneath that veneer, the country was still hemorrhaging. The IMF estimates that Venezuela's economy has contracted by 75% since 2013, the worst peacetime collapse in modern history. Hyperinflation, which officially ended in 2021, has left the bolivar so worthless that most transactions are now in dollars when they're not barter. The minimum wage is $3.50 a month. A teacher I spoke with told me she supplements her income by selling homemade arepas on weekends. That's not recovery. That's a country running on fumes. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime has survived not because it's strong, but because it's adaptable. It has outmaneuvered sanctions by pivoting to gold, cryptocurrency, and illicit trade routes. It has neutralized opposition by co-opting some factions while jailing or exiling others. And it has kept the military loyal through a mix of patronage, corruption, and sheer exhaustion. Most generals know that if the regime falls, they'll be the first ones held accountable. But this kind of survival comes at a cost. The state is hollowed out. Public services are a shell of what they once were. And the social contract that once bound Venezuelans to their government has been replaced by something far more: compliance in exchange for basic goods. Now, The establishment narrative in Washington and Brussels is that Venezuela is a failed state, a cautionary tale of socialism gone wrong. But that framing misses the point. Venezuela isn't failing, it's transforming. And the transformation isn't just economic, it's political. The old opposition, the one that rallied behind Juan Guaidó in 2019, has fractured. Some of its leaders are in exile. Others have cut deals with the government. The ones who remain are either too radical to negotiate or too compromised to be credible. Meanwhile, the regime has quietly allowed a limited reopening of the political space, not out of magnanimity, but because it needs a safety valve. The 2024 elections are a perfect example. Maduro allowed Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular figure, to run, only to disqualify her at the last minute. He then handpicked a lesser-known candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, to face him in a vote that was neither free nor fair. The message was the regime will tolerate opposition, but only on its terms. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. The first is the status quo, where Maduro muddles through. He wins the 2024 election, either fairly or through fraud, and the US responds with a mix of sanctions and quiet diplomacy. The economy stabilizes at a low level, but the brain drain continues. Another 500,000 Venezuelans flee in the next year, adding to the 7.7 million who've already left. The regime tightens its grip on the military and the judiciary, while allowing just enough economic liberalization to keep the elite happy. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a kind of Latin American authoritarian, isolated, but not collapsing. The problem? This is unsustainable. The country's infrastructure is crumbling. Its oil production, which once topped 3 million barrels a day, is now below 800,000. And the social fabric is fraying. A country can't run on dollars and despair forever. The second scenario is a negotiated transition. This is what the Biden administration has been pushing for, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Maduro has signaled that he's open to talks if the price is right. The US has already eased some sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions, and there's a growing faction within the regime that wants a deal. The military, in particular, is divided. Some generals want to cash out while they still can. Others are ideologically committed to the revolution. The key player here is Diosdado Cabello, the regime's hardline enforcer. If he can be convinced that a transition is in his interest, the rest of the government might follow. But here's the: any transition would have to include guarantees for the military and the ruling elite. That means amnesty, asset protection, and a role in the new political order. And that's a hard sell for the opposition, which has spent years demanding justice for corruption and human rights abuses. The third scenario is the wildest sudden collapse. This could happen in a few ways. A military coup, triggered by infighting or economic desperation. A popular uprising, sparked by another round of hyperinflation or a stolen election. Or an external shock, like a US military intervention, though that's the least likely, given Washington's reluctance to get bogged down in another Latin American quagmire. The problem with this scenario is that it's unpredictable. Venezuela's institutions are too weak to manage a transition, and the country could easily descend into chaos. The last time Venezuela had a sudden power vacuum, in 2019, the result was a constitutional crisis and a failed attempt at regime change. This time, the stakes are even higher. Now, here's where things get interesting. The US isn't the only player with skin in this game. Russia and China have both invested heavily in Venezuela, and they're not going to walk away without a fight. Moscow has provided military support, intelligence sharing, and economic lifelines. Beijing has extended billions in loans, secured oil concessions, and positioned itself as the regime's financial backstop. Both countries see Venezuela as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect their interests. That means if the US pushes too hard for regime change, Russia and China will push back either by doubling down on Maduro or by propping up a successor who's just as hostile to Washington. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, in my view, is a slow-motion transition, one that plays out over years, not months. Maduro will hold on to power as long as he can, but the regime will continue to erode. The opposition will fracture, with some factions cutting deals and others refusing to compromise. The military will remain the kingmaker, extracting concessions in exchange for its loyalty. And the US will be left with it accept a messy, imperfect transition or risk a collapse that could destabilize the entire region. Here's the thing about they're never clean. Look at South Africa after apartheid, or Chile after Pinochet. The old guard doesn't just disappear, it negotiates its way out, often on its own terms. Venezuela will be no different. The question is whether the US and its allies are willing to accept that reality, or whether they'll keep chasing the illusion of a perfect solution. Let me leave you with this. In 2002, when Hugo Chavez was briefly ousted in a coup, the US was quick to recognize the new government. Within 48 hours, Chavez was back in power, and the US was left looking foolish. That moment should have been in Venezuela. The rules of the game are different. The country has a long history of resisting foreign intervention, and its people are deeply suspicious of outside meddling. If the US wants to shape Venezuela's future, it needs to work with the grain of Venezuelan politics, not against it. That means engaging with the regime, not just the opposition. It means offering incentives, not just threats. And it means accepting that change, when it comes, will be messy, imperfect, and slow. Because in geopolitics, as in life, the only thing worse than a bad deal is no deal at all. And right now, Venezuela is running out of time. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about oil or socialism or even Maduro himself, it's about the unraveling of an entire regional order that the US helped construct over the past century. Since the Monroe Doctrine, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could dictate terms with impunity. But that era is ending, and Venezuela is the clearest symptom of its decline. The question isn't whether the US can still call the shots in Caracas, it's whether it can adapt to a world where it no longer holds all the cards. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The country's collapse has already sent shockwaves through the hemisphere. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled since 2015, creating the largest displacement crisis in the Americas, bigger than Syria's. Colombia, which has absorbed nearly 3 million of them, is now dealing with rising xenophobia, strained public services, and a resurgence of armed groups in border regions. Peru and Ecuador have seen political instability fueled in part by anti-immigrant backlash. Even Chile, long the poster child for neoliberal stability, has faced protests where Venezuelan migrants were scapegoated for economic woes. This isn't just a humanitarian tragedy, it's a geopolitical time bomb. And the longer the crisis drags on, the more it erodes the credibility of the very institutions like the OAS and the Inter-American Democratic Charter that the US has relied on to maintain its influence. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no good options left in Venezuela, only bad ones and worse ones. The Biden administration has tried to thread the needle, maintaining sanctions while quietly engaging with Maduro's government on issues like oil swaps and hostage releases. But this half-measure approach satisfies no one. The hardliners in Congress, led by figures like Senator Marco Rubio, accuse the White House of appeasement, while the opposition in Venezuela sees it as proof that the US is abandoning them. Meanwhile, Russia and China are playing the long game, offering Maduro just enough economic lifelines to keep him afloat while positioning themselves as the indispensable partners in Venezuela's post-crisis reconstruction. In 2023 alone, China extended $5 billion in loans to Caracas, and Rosneft, Russia's state oil giant, has been quietly extending its footprint in Venezuela's energy sector despite US sanctions. These aren't acts of charity, they're investments in a future where Venezuela's resources are controlled by regimes that don't answer to Washington. So what's the grand strategy here? If I were advising the White House, I'd argue for a three-pronged approach, one that acknowledges the limits of US power while still trying to shape outcomes. First, the US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and focus on managing the crisis rather than toppling the regime. That means easing sanctions in exchange for concrete concessions, like free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment to humanitarian aid access. It's not pretty, but it's better than the complete collapse that hands the country over to criminal gangs and foreign mercenaries. Second, the US should work with regional partners to create a multilateral framework for Venezuela's transition, one that includes not just the opposition but also moderate Chavista factions and civil society groups. The Lima Group, which was formed in 2017 to coordinate a response to Venezuela, has largely fallen apart, but it could be revived with a more inclusive mandate. And third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the day after Maduro by investing in Venezuela's neighbors, Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean, to help them absorb the economic and social fallout of the crisis. That means more aid, more trade, and more diplomatic engagement, not just military posturing. But let's be none of this is likely to happen. The U.S. political system is too polarized to sustain a coherent Venezuela policy, and the foreign policy establishment is still addicted to the idea that Washington can dictate outcomes in Latin America. The result is a policy that oscillates between tough talk and half-hearted engagement, leaving everyone frustrated and no one satisfied. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. Venezuela's oil production has fallen from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. Its refineries are crumbling, its infrastructure is collapsing, and its people are exhausted. The country isn't just running out of time, it's running out of options. Which brings me to the final. Venezuela's crisis is a warning for the rest of the world. It's a case study in what happens when a country's institutions fail, when its elites prioritize power over people, and when the international community can't agree on a way forward. But it's also a test of whether the U.S. can adapt to a multipolar world where it no longer calls all the shots. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, hasn't worked. The new one hasn't been written yet. And in the meantime, millions of Venezuelans are paying the price. I'll leave you with this thought. In 1958, after a decade of dictatorship under Marcos Pérez Jiménez, Venezuela held free elections and became one of the most stable democracies in Latin America. It was a moment of hope, a testament to the country's resilience. But that moment didn't last. The same forces that led to Chávez's rise, corruption, inequality, foreign meddling, are still at play today. The difference now is that the stakes are higher, the players are more powerful, and the margin for error is thinner than ever. Venezuela's door to a new order is open, but whether that order brings stability or chaos depends on whether the world is willing to learn from its mistakes or repeat them.